Bienvenidos, Ushamdi, and welcome to this Hut8 networking Techtorial. As you can see from the title, we're going to be talking about Cisco ASA basic configuration. Now, the code that is listed there, the Hut8 ASA free intro code, that is the code to use if you visit udemy.com, where this course in its entirety is going to be posted to udemy.com for free. And all you need to do is use that Hut8 ASA free intro code in order to gain free access to the course, which is going to be launched on August 1st. And so in this module, Module 0, we're going to be talking about simply the password recovery for a Cisco ASA firewall. Now, what are the objectives of the Techtorial? Again, we want to provide you with the absolute best and most comprehensive introduction to Cisco's Adaptive Security Appliance, or the ASA. We're going to be using multiple demonstrations. We're going to be spending the majority of our time on the command line, and we're going to start with password recovery. We're going to talk about file system cleanup, and again, all of the topics after password recovery, you're going to be able to see at udemy.com absolutely free. We're going to walk through the steps to upgrade the ASA. We're going to go through initial ASA configuration tasks, remote management access, network address translation, which is always an important one. We're going to talk about the object groups and how the 8.4 and greater than code differed from the previous code with the ASA. We're going to look at the modular policy framework, or the MPF, when we take a look at maybe allowing ping responses to come back through. Now, we're also going to configure AAA, or authentication, authorization, and accounting, as well as DHCP, and we're going to look at clientless SSL VPN and AnyConnect client VPN. Now, who is this course aimed at? If you're studying for your CCNA security, this is a fantastic way to really understand better how you would go through the basic configuration tasks on the ASA firewall. In addition, we're going to take you from day 0. In other words, we're assuming that you've just received this ASA firewall, whether you got it from eBay or from some other means. You've come into possession of an ASA firewall and you want to deploy this firewall. Maybe it's in your home network, maybe it's in your home office, small office. This tutorial and this course is literally going to walk you through from password recovery all the way to setting up remote access onto your local LAN, as well as port forwarding. Maybe you've got some remote, you want to use VNC client to connect to a VNC server on a Mac that you have on your local area network, and plugging it directly into your service provider and getting an address via DHCP. And so again, this is going to cover literally everything that you would need to do to deploy the ASA 5505, 5510, 5520, whatever the model number of the ASA may be. This is going to walk you through every step required to have a 100% fully functional solution, whether it's for your home office or just your house or your small business. All right, so again, Module 0, we're going to start with password recovery because we're assuming that you've just come into possession of a Cisco ASA firewall. Now, the first thing that we want to do is power cycle the Cisco Adaptive Security Appliance. Now, you can see that you can press escape or break, and this is going to be on Windows. When you're using the Mac, you're going to press the command escape sequence, and you're going to press command and escape at the same time, and that is going to break you out. And so let's jump onto the command line here, and if you take a look, you can see that we've just power cycled this ASA. And again, we've missed the opportunity to go ahead and hit the command escape, and this demonstration is being done on a Mac, and so that's the key sequence I would hit. Now, if I was to try to go from user exec into privilege exec, you can see we're going to have a password prompt here. Again, if your ASA shows up and it's not wiped clean and has an existing config with an enable password on it, you need to know what that password is. You can see here, typically you can hit enter. and it'll simply let you in, and that's if it's been wiped completely clean. But here we obviously have a password, right? And it's Cisco 12345. So let's go ahead and say that we don't know what that enable password is, and we need to reload the firewall. So I'm simply going to type reload, and we're going to give it a couple seconds here. And what we're going to discuss now is not only the key sequence of command escape that's going to get us into ROM-MON mode, and you can see we're going to be seeing here very quickly, there's that 10 seconds. You can see it counts down. I'm going to hit command and escape, and we get dumped into ROM-MON mode. Now, what do we do from this mode here? Well, we want to see what the configuration register settings are on this ASA 5505. And what we know is that when the ASA is going to boot, it's going to read the startup configuration, and it's going to pull that in and use it as its running configuration. And so just like password recovery on an ISR G1 or G2 series router, we want that startup configuration not to be read. So let's go ahead and type conf reg, and this is the command that's going to allow me to see what the current configuration is for the configuration register. And I need to make sure that I annotate this, that I write this down and keep that value. And again, the leading zeros here are not needed, so we can simply say 0x1. And what this configuration register setting represents is that every time the ASA boots, it's going to read the startup configuration and load that from flash into the running configuration. Now it's asking us, do we wish to change this configuration? So we're going to say yes, because again, we want it to skip the startup configuration. So the only prompt where we're going to make a change here, we're going to accept the defaults for everything except this option right here. In other words, disable system configuration. Here, I'm going to say yes. So I walk myself through, we get to the end, and you can see that we've now been presented with a different configuration register value. Now, something important to point out is I just walked through a series of steps where I had to type in conf reg and then accept the defaults, except for disable system configuration, all to get to the point where my configuration register is now 0x40. And when I now boot the ASA, it's going to skip the startup configuration. In other words, it's going to boot up and bring the ASA up as if there is no configuration whatsoever. Now, there's an alternative way to do this. And now that you've seen how to do this, if you didn't know that that was the value that was required in order to have the ASA skip bringing the startup configuration into play, you could have simply typed conf reg 0x40. And that also would set the configuration register settings. So again, we've now seen two different ways from the ROM-MON prompt that we can change and hard code and set the configuration register value. We can either say conf reg and hit enter and walk through the prompts. And again, if you're not familiar with this value here, you would want to do that to see what the value is on your ASA. And again, it should be 0x1, and I'm on a 5505. Now, we've got the configuration register value set to 0x40, which means we're ready now to go ahead and boot this ASA. Now, when you do this, it's going to boot the first bootable image that it finds in Flash. And so while that's happening, let's transition back here real quickly and take a look. So you can see it's going to talk about entering conf reg, and these are the values that we're interested in. Now, we've seen the 0x1, and that is the regular normal run state configuration register setting that we had on the ASA 5505. 0x40 is what we changed it to, which means it's going to skip the startup configuration and boot the ASA up as if there was no configuration. And we'll see 0x0 as we work our way through here. So again, we've already walked through these options. And now we're on to the home stretch. So the next prompt that we're going to be presented with is going to be that Cisco ASA prompt, similar to what we saw when we had initially logged in. And you can see here the firewall is coming up. We're going to have a series of licensing messages. And now we are at that Cisco ASA prompt. So if I was to say show version, right, and we come down to the very end, you can see that it lists the configuration register value via that show version command. And we can see what it's set to down here. Now, this is where we need to be very, very careful. And there's going to be a fork in the road here. In other words, we've got a decision tree that we're going to run into. So there's no password. We're just going to be able to hit enter. But before we do that, let's talk about this. If we want to retain the configuration, let's say that you're simply watching this video because you want to know how to save or how to recover the existing configuration, and you just want to reset your password. So let's go ahead and we'll walk through that. So here we are on the command line. Remember I said if there's no configuration, when I type enable or EN to get into privilege exec, and I hit enter, it'll prompt me for the password. But if I hit enter again, there is no password. In fact, if I say show run, you'll see that this is just simply the default configuration. Every interface of the eight interfaces on this ASA 5505 is actually shut down. And so nothing is set. And we can see that here, right? And so here we are back at the prompt. So now we're going to approach this from the point of view that this is our firewall. The configuration that's on here I'd like to keep, and I just simply want to go ahead and reset the password to a value that I know. And so be very careful because there's an order of operations concern here. If I was to go ahead and go into global config by typing configure terminal, if you see this notice here, you can just simply say no because we're not going to be providing Cisco, any reporting information. So when I go into global config mode, I have a couple of choices, right? If I were to set, and again, this is going to be what not to do if you wanted to save everything that you have and you're just simply trying to reset the password. If I say enable password, and we'll just say Cisco 12345, and I hit enter, and then I say copy startup config to running config. What is the outcome of those commands in that sequence? And this is very important. So you don't want to do the enable password first, right? Which is what we did here. So we reset that enable password that allows me to get into privilege exec and global config. And then I take my startup config, which is the config that we want to keep, and I copy it into the running config. If I do that, I have just overwritten the enable password command that I entered in here. And I've just replaced that with the enable password that I do not remember because I'm trying to recover from not remembering that password, right? So again, there's a order of operations. Make sure that you don't do this. Do not set the enable password and then bring your configuration in. You want to bring the configuration in and then set the password. So if I transition back into the terminal window here, and let's back up because we don't want to do that. And actually, we're going to go ahead and do that. Sorry about that. So copy startup config to running config, right? So this is what I would do first. And you can see here, destination name, running config. So that now becomes my running configuration. Whatever the startup configuration was, and that was the configuration that I couldn't remember the enable password for. That is now the running configuration. So now I would say enable password, and we'll say ABC123 and hit enter. Because again, I've copied that startup configuration along with the unknown enable password value into the running config. And now I have just overwritten that unknown enable password value with a value that I do know and that I'm probably going to write down so that in case I forget it again, I would be able to just simply reference a piece of paper. Because remember, right now, the firewall is probably not passing traffic. I mean, we've copied the startup configuration in, so at that point it probably was. But prior to this, when we went into ROM mode, when we reloaded the firewall, when we skipped the startup configuration at boot up, we're down at that point. The firewall's not passing any traffic. As soon as I bring my startup configuration in, then we're back online. So what would I want to do at this point? Well, we've gone ahead and we reset the password. So what I could do now, since I want to save this configuration, is I'm going to do a write mem, right? And what that does is that's analogous to copy running config to startup config. And so there's also something very important here. So when we ran these series of commands, remember, you don't want to put the enable password in and then bring in the startup config. That's a no. We don't want to do that. But we also need to be aware of the order of these two options. So copy from the startup config into the running config. If we were here and I had said copy running config to startup config, what would the outcome have been? Exactly. I would have a 100% blank ASA configuration with my enable password set to Cisco 12345, and that is it. And I would have just lost my entire startup configuration. And again, the use case that we're talking about right now is we wanted to maintain that. I had just forgotten the enable password. I want to keep my startup config. Because if I said copy running config to startup config here, I am now starting from scratch all over again, right? So again, we want to maintain the configuration. All I want to do is recover my password. I say copy startup config running config. I then set my password to a value that I'm going to remember. And now I issue either write memory or copy running config to startup config. And at this point, I have everything in place to go ahead and reload the firewall, except for one minor thing. And that is what? If I say show version, what's going to happen when I boot the firewall? Exactly. It's going to ignore that startup configuration that I just created with that write memory command that has my existing config and my new enable password. And so we need to go ahead and say config register, config register, and we need to set it to the hex value. And this is where it's very important that at some point you annotated that value that we saw earlier when we did the conf reg and rommon, because that's the value we're going to put in here. And again, assuming that you're not familiar with the values that are required. And so the leading zeros are not needed. So I can simply say 0x1 and hit enter. Now when I say show version, let's see what we see down here at the bottom. So this is interesting. The configuration register is 0x40, but it says right here it'll be 0x1 at the next reload. So let's go ahead and reload. Now, I could do a write mem and then reload, but when I do reload, the ASA is smart enough to know that I've made a change, right? And the change that I've made since the last time I typed write memory was to change the configurations register so that when we boot, it will pull the startup config and bring it into memory as the running config. And so it's going to ask me, do you want to proceed with the reload? And I'm going to go ahead and we're going to let this go. And let's see what happens here. And we'll give it a second to reboot. And while that's rebooting, let's step over here real quickly. And so we walk through this use case right here of the copy startup config, running config. And again, we want to save whatever the configuration was that was there. Now, in a lot of cases, you don't want to save the configuration. Again, maybe you just got this ASA off of eBay and you want to start from scratch to have a completely 100% clean slate from which to create your configuration. If that was the case, as soon as you typed enable the first time after you had recovered, I shouldn't say recovered the password, but after the router came up with a blank slate, all you had to do was what we talked about with the copy running config to startup config, was to say write memory. And that would copy the blank running config on top of, right, and replace that startup config that contains the configuration, maybe from whoever sold you the firewall, as well as their enable password, because maybe they didn't clean that firewall off and wipe the config. That write memory command would do that, so it would copy running config to startup config. And then again, the universal next step after we do that, so irrespective of whether we're just recovering the password or whether I want to start from scratch with a blank slate, the next command that I'm going to run is config register 0x1, right? And again, we saw the show version command is the command that shows me what the current configuration register setting is. Now we just need to reload the device. We did. These ASA 5505s come up very, very fast. So here we are. So let's type EN and hit enter, and it's asking me for the password. Well, I'm just going to hit enter. And the reason I'm only going to hit enter right here is I'm going to prove that the configuration register is not 0x40 and it's not ignoring the startup config. It's just the opposite, is that it was changed, and I hit enter, and there we go, invalid password. So it did not load a blank configuration. So let's say ABC 123, and now we are at the privilege exec mode prompt. So the last thing we're going to talk about is that configuration register setting. Let's get into global config, and we're going to say config register 0x0. Again, if I were to say show run, show version, and let's include register, and let's see, I can't remember if it was a capital, no, lowercase r. And there we go. And so the configuration register is 0x1 right now, but it'll be 0x0 at the next reload. So let's see what ends up happening here. And again, when we do that 0x0, remember, I'm not doing it from a power cycle. So if you're on the ASA and for whatever reason you want to get into ROMMON mode, this is the way to do it, right? And so now let me go ahead and say confreg. Again, this is going to display for me my current configuration register settings. And it's asking me, do you wish to change this configuration? Now remember, I don't have to say yes here and then walk through all those prompts. I can just simply say, no, I'm not interested in changing it by walking through the prompts, because I know that all I need to say is config reg or conf reg, and then the value that was the default that's going to read that startup configuration during normal runtime operations, and 99.9% of the time, that's the configuration register value that you want to go with, is the 0x1. Because again, when the ASA boots, it's going to take that startup config from non-volatile memory, and it's going to pull it into memory as the running config. And so here we are at this prompt again. I'll say boot. And now the the ASA is going to go ahead and finish its boot sequence. And to prove that what we just did there didn't change anything, I'm going to go ahead and wait for it to come back up here. And again, this is going to be the end of the module. We're just going to wait for it to come up to prove that we still have that privilege exec password, that enable password set to ABC123. And hopefully, you now have a much better understanding of not just the tasks that are required to walk through and recover your password, but the different ways you can go about doing it and the order of operations concerns that you need to be aware of when you're performing the password recovery. Remember that copy startup config, running config is very important, especially if you're trying to save the configuration, right? And all you're trying to do is recover your password. You have to make sure it's in this order. And then the same is true if you're just trying to start from scratch. As soon as you get in, after you've booted from ROM-MOM mode and you've changed your configuration register values, you can just simply type write memory. And at that point, the ASA is 100% clean. It's a blank slate ready for you to configure. And let's drop back here to the command line. So here we are again, and let's say EN for enable. To get into privilege exec mode from user exec, I'm going to hit enter. And you'll notice it doesn't like that. I'm going to say Cisco 12345, which was the previous enable password. It doesn't like that. And then the current enable password, which I just reset, ABC123. And there you go. And now we are logged back into our ASA firewall, and I can go ahead and take the next step in the configuration, which would be moving on. Again, we're going to walk through a use case here of I've got this new firewall and I'm going to deploy it in my small office, small business, my house, whatever the case may be. So I'm going to leave questions open here on this YouTube video. I hope to see you over at udemy.com. Again, the remainder of this course, 100% free, and you are going to have a 100% fully functional configuration. I'm going to be using a 5505 to do this demonstration, but again, it's very similar on any of the other platforms, and it's right here at this Techtorial waypoint where we would transition into file system cleanup tasks. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next module.